Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the U.S. Congress. During his speech, Zelensky expressed gratitude and thanked the U.S. President Joe Biden for supporting Ukraine in the ongoing war. He further said that Ukraine is alive and kicking.
Against all odds and doom and gloom scenarios, Ukraine didn't fall. Ukraine is alive and kicking.
Now, the Ukrainian president, who received a rousing welcome before his address, told the Congress that Ukraine has defeated Russia in the battle for minds of the world. Zelensky vowed that his country would never surrender to Russia.
And it gives me good reason to share with you. Ukraine holds its lines and will never surrender.
Now, during his 30-minute speech, Zelensky thanked the United States for its aid to his country and emphasized on how U.S. assistance for Ukraine is not charity, but an investment in security.
Financial assistance is also critically important, and I would like to thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for both financial packages you have already provided us with and the ones you may be willing to decide on. Your money is not charity. It's an investment in the global security and democracy that we handle in the most responsible way.
Now, before ending his speech, the Ukrainian president said that the world is too interconnected and interdependent to allow someone to stay aside. After ending his speech, Zelensky gifted a Ukrainian flag with messages written on it by the soldiers from the city of Bakhmut, which Zelensky had visited a day prior. For more on this, our correspondent Susan Tehrani has sent us this report from New York. Listen in.
This is Volodymyr Zelensky's first trip outside of his country since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and comes at the 300th day mark of the conflict. The Ukrainian leader is seeking to solidify America's support ahead of a shift to a divided government in Washington, and at a time when it seems that the conflict will drag on into the new year. The White House said that the Ukrainian president's trip to the United States will last about 8 hours. He met with President Biden, held a press conference before addressing Congress. U.S. lawmakers have unveiled a spending bill that carries an additional $44.9 billion to help Ukraine as well as support NATO allies. The prolonged conflict, however, has led to questions by some conservative Republicans as well as progressive Democrats about how long Washington should continue its multi-billion-dollar support for Ukraine in an effort to provide it with military, economic, and humanitarian assistance. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World as well.
Now, for more on this, international affairs expert Charles Ekapshin is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the U.S. Congress. What do you think were some of the key highlights of this address?
Well, I think really it was an effort to reach hearts and minds. The 2022 year is drawing to a close. The war has been going on for almost a year. It shows no signs of abating. And I think Zelensky was coming here, especially with Congress about to change hands. The Republicans will have a majority in January, to say, we need your continued support. We thank you for everything you've given us, but this fight is not over. It was really an appeal to the average American and to the representatives of the average American to say, stay the course. This is a fight not just for Ukraine, but for democratic values around the world.
Right. That being said, how would you assess the United States' role in this war so far? Of course, we've seen large tranches of aid being given to Ukraine. How do you assess that?
Well, I think the U.S. has more or less found the right middle ground. President Biden said early on, we're not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. On the other hand, the U.S. is committed to help Ukraine defend itself, and the weapons that have been transferred are key to the success that Ukraine has enjoyed on the battlefield. I do think that once the Republicans are in control of the House in January, it may be more difficult for Biden to get all the assistance to Ukraine that he wants. I don't think U.S. policy will change. I think the solidarity across the Atlantic will continue, but it will get more complicated when it comes to securing congressional approval for assistance. And I think that's one of the reasons that Zelensky was here today, making his appeal to Democrats and Republicans alike.
Right. Now, looking at the war trajectory so far, how do you see the situation panning out in the months to come, in the next year, in fact?
Well, I'm guessing that we'll see a slowdown in the frontier of the war, in part because winter is setting in. It's snowy, it's cold, it makes armored movements more difficult, and in part because the Russians appear to have pulled back from overextended lines and they're building defensive fortifications. It may therefore be difficult for Ukraine to make the substantial kinds of gains that it has made over the last few months. I do expect the Ukrainians to continue to push forward, to continue to take back land that the Russians have taken since February 24. I don't think that we're likely to see a quote-unquote victory, that is to say, the full expulsion of Russian troops from Ukraine. Accordingly, this is the beginning of what could turn into a long war and maybe eventually a frozen conflict. No clear end, but a dying down of the intensity of the war.
Right, absolutely. Now, that being said, we have seen this earlier as well when the Ukrainian side said that the Russian side is now trying to turn this into a prolonged armed conflict. Now, how does that serve the Russian side, would you say?
Well, I think from the Russian side, the war has been a strategic defeat. Putin has not succeeded in toppling the regime and pulling Ukraine back into a Russian sphere of influence. Now I think his goal is to avoid complete defeat and to avoid a potential threat to his own government by a Russian populace, by his own Russian advisors who have begun to lose faith in him. There's no sign that Putin is backing down. In fact, he seems to be doubling down. And I think that even though the prospect of a victory, that is to say, Russia somehow toppling the regime and pulling Ukraine back into a Russian sphere, that doesn't seem possible for now. As a consequence, I think Putin is really going to try to hunker down, to grab at least some chunk of eastern Ukraine and say this is now part of greater Russia in an effort to sell that as victory to his own people.
All right. Well, Mr. Charles A. Kupchan, thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast with all your insights on this.
Bye-bye.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.